Welcome back. I have some good news and bad news. The good news is that you're not going to hear me talk, and you're going to hear me just ask questions. And the bad news is that you're stuck with me, whether you like it or not, for another hour and 10 minutes. I'll try to be less obnoxious. This is the panel on Iran's foreign and security policy, which is an area that I follow and I've written about, and I can tell you that the experts we have assembled here are among the best in the business. So I'm going to start with you, Ariane, and I'll ask each of you one question, and then occasionally I'm going to challenge you and ask follow-up questions. First question is, Iran's regional policy today has become one of the main concerns of the Trump administration. And people have said a lot about Iran's regional policy. Some people believe that if we put economic pressure on Iran, then Iran is going to diminish its activities in the region. Some people believe that Iran has become an imperialist power, expansionist power. In your judgment, what are the main trends that you see in the evolution of Iranian foreign policy in the past 40 years? And please, as you describe that evolution, tell us about continuity and change. Do you see any changes in Iranian foreign policy, or more or less it has been continuously on the same level? Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I think the obvious area where you see a lot of consistency is the rhetoric, right? As the ambassador this morning pointed out, you have slogans that have footnotes now, but you still have many of the same slogans that you heard 40 years ago. I think if you start to actually peel off the rhetoric a little bit and pay attention to what Iran has been doing, it's actually changed quite a bit in terms of the policies and the drivers of its foreign policy over the past 40 years. Now, ironically, in some ways, Iran has largely departed from the idea of exporting the revolution as the revolutionaries had envisioned it during the 1978-79 protests and movement. But they have in some ways expanded their influence, I think, beyond the dreams that Khomeini had. I think if he came back today and looked at what Iran has been doing in the region, he would perhaps be surprised by how much it's been able to expand its influence and its presence in the region. But I don't think that the export of the revolution, that ideology, are actually the key drivers behind Iran's policy today. I think there are very convenient means by which Iran has been able to work with various groups. We see it in Lebanon, we see it in Afghanistan, where Iran appeals to certain cultural, ethnic, but especially religious and ideological ties with various groups to actually forge these connections and these relationships that it has with them. But ultimately, what it's trying to pursue is much more interest-driven than it is ideologically driven. So one of the major, I think, areas where we see a change in Iranian foreign and security policy over the past 40 years is that at the beginning of the revolution, and especially with the Iran-Iraq war, one of the key ideas was that no state should ever become strong enough to challenge Iran, to threaten Iran as Saddam had done in the 1980s. In other words, if a central government like Baghdad, Afghanistan under the Taliban, became strong enough that it was able to challenge Iranian territorial integrity and national sovereignty and national unity, then you would potentially see another Iran-Iraq war. So a key driver throughout the post-Iran-Iraq war period, throughout the 90s, for Iran was to actually stop that from happening and to make sure that no central government was able to challenge Iran. And that was done through a number of means, right? One of them is the ballistic missile program, the nuclear program, you could argue was resumed in the 1980s, partially in response to the Iran-Iraq war. But importantly, through the forging of ties with various non-state actors, militias, terrorist groups throughout the region, which would allow Iran to undermine central governments. Then comes 9/11. And Iran is conveniently presented this new regional landscape with the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. The policies, the investment it had made in those countries begins to pay off, right? It had been working with these groups in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and now it was able to have stakeholders in place that it was able to work with to assert its presence and its influence in those countries. And of course, as those two conflicts drag on and the Arab Spring happens, Iran is presented both a dilemma, essentially. It's presented an opportunity if it manages to seize it. But at the same time, there was this very sort of acute threat of Iran being next on the list for the United States should Afghanistan and Iraq go well. I think it had the conflicts have largely turned into an opportunity for Iran, though the Iranians, as they typically do, overreached quite a bit. And so in 2014, when the Islamic State declared a caliphate, it sort of began to raise questions in Tehran about the direction of Iranian foreign policy under the Islamic Republic. The question was, okay, so we know that we don't want strong central governments that would be able to threaten Iran. But at the same time, if we weaken them to the point where you have a collapse of the central authority leading to a power vacuum in countries, then you get terrorist groups like ISIS, which are as much, if not more of a threat than more rational central governments. So since 2014, what we've seen, in my opinion, is the emergence of this new hedging policy that is very difficult actually to balance. And it's the idea that no central authority should be strong enough to become the next Saddam Hussein Iraq. But at the same time, none of them should actually collapse to the point where you have a region that is composed of disintegrating states where you can have terrorist groups and not unfriendly powers. After all, Iran does forge ties with terrorist groups, but not all of them are friendly toward Iran. And when they're not friendly toward Iran, they're a threat, like ISIS has been. And this is an incredibly difficult thing to navigate. It's led to these conflicting policies, I think, that we've seen in Iraq especially, but elsewhere in the region as well, where on the one hand, Iran works with the government, while on the other hand, undermining it in some ways by working with all these factions, these militias, these terrorist groups that exist in the region. I don't think this is a big departure, but I think it is definitely an evolution that we're seeing in the way the regime has thought about its foreign and security policies.
One of the major issues that people talk about is sectarianism. We know demography is destiny. If you look at Iran and the countries of the Persian Gulf, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, Shiites, broadly defined, are the majority. Mm-hmm. Something a lot of people don't know, especially in this country. So tell us, how has Iran pushed for sectarianism? And is Iran the only country responsible for pushing this sectarianism? And how much of Iranian regional policy is really based on sectarian considerations?
I would actually argue that for quite a few power centers in Iran, and I would argue actually most of them, there is this understanding that sectarianism is not going to help Iran ultimately, right? That the odds are not in Iran's favor. The problem is that there are a number of policies that Iran has pursued that have had a number of sectarian elements and that have had a number of sectarian side effects. So I would argue that ultimately the Rouhani government, for example, understands the problems it's facing when it comes to sectarian tensions. And they have tried to minimize that, especially in Iraq, right? With the rise of ISIS again, that was a big it was a big red flag that the policies Iran had been pursuing over the past decade were not helping its image, were not helping secure the power of the friendly forces within Iraq. And so you had this sort of recognition that they had to step away from those sectarian policies. They had to actually actively reach out to Sunnis. So I'll give you one quick example. In 2014, 2015, most people know that Iran was supporting Shia militias in Iraq. But Iran was also reaching out to Sunnis, to Sunni forces in Iraq. It was not very convincing, and it was not very fruitful ultimately. It wasn't able to mobilize more than just a few hundred Sunni forces to fight with it. But it was trying to do that. And the reason for it was that they understood that pursuing purely sectarian policies was not going to be in Iran's benefit. I think, unfortunately, one of the, going back to the slogans and to the rhetoric that comes out of Tehran is not conducive to having a sort of non-sectarian policy, that it does actually create some of those tensions. It does contribute to some of those tensions. I think the mic just went on. So I think the rhetoric is actually part of the problem here, but I do think that there is a recognition that sectarianism is not an effective tool in galvanizing groups.
I know you want to respond to what you said, Randa. Go ahead and please respond, and then I'll ask you the question.
I mean, your last sentence gave me the good segue into my comment, and I disagree with you that it was not an effective tool. I think in the Syrian war, sectarian narrative was an effective tool in mobilizing the groups, Afghans, Pakistanis, Shias, Iraqi Shias, Lebanese Shias, to come and fight to support Assad at a time when supporting a regime like the Assad regime, committing the genocide that he has committed, was very much counter to everything that the Iranian revolution stands for, to what the Shia theology stands for, to what the Shia prophet stands for. And so I think having that kind of a narrative, basically having an Iraqi Shia going, I'm going to Damascus to not, basically when you interview them, it was not to support Assad, it was to come to the defense of the shrine of Sayyida Zainab. It was to come to the defense of the history and the legacy and the family of Imam Hussein. That's the sectarian narrative which Iran, which Hezbollah have used and cultivated extremely powerfully and extremely skillfully. And it was in that way, if the policy was the survival of the Assad regime, which was in the interest of Iran to have that sectarian narrative proved very effective tool in achieving that policy.
Yes, please, yes. So, Challenger. Yeah.
So I don't think we fundamentally disagree,
no.
Right? So
different way of looking at it.
I want to put it in, put a different spin on it. I think it was effective in galvanizing the foreign fighters that are now in Syria, predominantly in Syria, and possibly moving elsewhere. But if you look at the foreign policy more holistically, then the sectarian element is not helpful, right? Again, if you look at Iraq in 2014, a lot of the sectarian policies that were pursued by the government at that time and that Iran was backing and was supporting backfired, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't have ISIS. And one more thing is that actually for a lot of the foreign fighter forces, I think that, yes, absolutely Shia ideology plays into it. But you also have the more pragmatic, they ultimately want to feed their families. Many Afghans who have been recruited, whether they're refugees in Iran or not, they've been promised residency rights. They've been promised healthcare. They've been promised education for their kids. And that's a big driver that has helped galvanize these thousands of people who've gone there. Thousands of people have gone there not for the shrines. They've gone there to feed their families. And
if you go beyond the Levant, there is one country besides Iran that has 97% Shia majority, and it's called Azerbaijan. And there is one called Armenia, 98% Christians.
Yeah.
And in the fight between Azerbaijan, a Shiite country, one of the former republics of the Soviet Union, and Armenia, Iran took the side of Armenia. Now, going back to you.
No, but my point was that in certain settings, Iran deploys whatever tools, whatever narratives helps achieve its interest in that setting.
100%.
And in the case of Syria, the sectarian narrative was an effective tool and it was deployed effectively.
Absolutely.
Completely agree with you. And my question now is this. Paul Kennedy, in his book, The Collapse of the Great Empire, argues that great empires have collapsed because they overextended, overreached, and the economic foundation of the respective empires could not produce enough goods and services to catch up with their overexpansion. Now, Iran is not, of course, an empire, but I think what Paul Kennedy is saying applies to Iran. So with that in mind, what are the limits of the Iranian Middle East strategy in your mind, in your judgment? Because I know you've written about it and you make a lot of good sense.
Well, related to this question is the issue of which I have been now struggling with is, has Iran reached a ceiling in its regional influence? And when you talk about ceiling, you also talk about floor. So on one hand, let me talk quickly about the floor because that goes to the debate in this country. Let's start with the assumption that we are not going, and nobody is going to be able to push Iran out of the areas where they have now entrenched themselves. You can contain it, you can limit, but you are not going to push them. That's a floor. So this whole idea of rolling back Iranian influence, it doesn't make sense. It's not going to be achieved, and it's very clear that in Syria we are abandoning it already. So that's the floor. So the floor is Iran is there to stay. The question is to what extent it's going to be entrenching itself there and through what tools. And that's where the debate is about. So in terms of ceiling, I would argue that pretty much Iran, given where it was today, remember the first entry point by Iran into the region was in 1982 when Hafez al-Assad opened the gates of Damascus to the IRGC to come through Damascus into northeast Lebanon, into the eastern Beqa region, and start training what eventually became the Hezbollah. That was the gate. And that's why Syria has always been important to Iran. It's a lot of debate in this town about Syria being important to Iran because it's a conduit for shipping weapons. Syria was the first state legitimizer, Arab state legitimizer of Iranian presence and role in the Middle East. And
Correct.
That's something that, Iran has always valued, and that's why it went to an extreme extent in defending this regime. And this role that Syria has played vis-a-vis Iran within the region, it's not only exclusive of Hafez al-Assad, but it's something that the regime itself, with all its apparatus that has succeeded Hafez al-Assad with Bashar al-Assad, still carries on. So having said that, I think since then, since 1982 to what we are today, I totally agree with Ariane. I don't think Iranian even policymakers would have dreamed, in 1982 where they would be today in terms of the regional influence they have had in 4 Arab countries. And partly they are here, because of their opportunistic, sense of how to mine division and of being a smart, opportunistic player. Iranian strategy, strategic patience, willing to play the long game, willing to deploy the resources needed to play the long game and stay the course. Partly because they had a natural constituency with the Arab Shia in many of these countries, which ideologically felt a lot of affiliation. But partly, I have to say, it's the blunders of their opponents and their enemies. It's the blunder of the US in Iraq in the aftermath of the US invasion. It's the blunder of Israel in Lebanon in 1982 after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It's the blunder of, Saudi Arabia in Yemen, which created a perfect opportunity for, for Iran to mine this opportunity created to it. It's a blunder of the Arab regime writ large in terms of how they're dealt with important constituencies in their own societies, and created that perfect constituency or that perfect ally for Iran. So what I would say that given where we are today, Iran has pretty much reached this ceiling of its influence, except maybe there is one possibility of a potential expansion, and that will be, I will have to say that caveat is Bahrain, and we can talk about that in question and answer. But there are 5 factors where I think which are very much self-induced or makes this role or makes Iran a self-limiting power in the region. The first is something that you already have talked about, which is it is a Shia Persian power in a majority Arab Sunni region. They are in the 3 countries where they are, the majorities are Shia, but if we look at the totality of the Arab region, this is the dynamics. And we have to talk about this with all the luggage, with all the historical narrative this brings at home. Despite efforts by Iran since 1982 to cultivate relations with Sunni elements, despite their effort to really throw support behind Islamic Jihad, behind Hamas as a way to carry the Islamic Sunni street, especially the Islamist Arab Sunni street, still, I would say that Iran has a Sunni problem. At home, it has a Sunni problem in the Arab region. Iran, and not only Iran, its allies in the region have a Sunni problem. Assad has a Sunni problem. Hezbollah has a Sunni problem. The Houthis have a Sunni problem. The Iraqi Shia have a Sunni problem in their midst. And that's going to be their limiting ability of Iran to expand any further. The second factor, I would say, and I don't know if I'm using the wrong word, is it has a model problem. If you talk today, I travel frequently to Lebanon, and I talk with a lot of youth. I think Arab youth are just a fascinating today cohort to speak to, because it gives you faith in the future of the region. But when you talk with with Lebanese, and I'm talking here about Lebanese in southern suburbs of Beirut, these are Lebanese Shia who are identified by any standard as being a Hezbollah supporter, as being an Iran supporter, right? You ask him or her, which model, which country, which governance model you would like to have in your country? Where would you like to travel, for tourism? I don't hear Tehran. I don't hear the Iranian Revolution as a model. I hear Dubai as a model. I hear they want to go to Dubai. This is the picture there for the Arab youth. So the model of that Iran, offers is not a saleable model. Not even to the Iranian youth. It's not a saleable model to the Arab youth. And that's going to be a limiting problem going forward for Iran, as we are talking about a region where 50 to 70%, depending on the country to talk about, are under 30. So with the youth, with the Arab youth, Iran today, as it stands, does not sell. Does not have an attraction problem. It does not have attraction. Third is Iran's own domestic constituency in terms of limiting factor. I mean, you all know more than I about the chance in Tehran recently with the economic sanctions. Why are we putting money in Lebanon? Why are we funding Hezbollah? Why are we putting money in Syria? I think this is going to be a limiting factor going forward even more. Why? Because sustaining the Iranian influence that exists today, but also trying to expand it, is going to become even more costly than it is. And I would agree with Ariane, who said in her paper that this expanding of regional influence, this expanding influence that Iran has cultivated in the region, has really not been that costly. I mean, in Yemen, it's few Iranian cheap, few cheap Iranian weapons. That's the cost for Iran in Yemen with the Houthis. In Hezbollah, it has been more costly because you are talking about a much more layered, more multi-sector intervention. In Syria, it has been able to leverage, to limit the cost and to outsource, especially some of the fighting. In Iraq has resources, so it is less costly for. But I think going forward, the cost of this policy, this influence, this regional power is going to be, especially as Syria heads into construction, as Yemen heads eventually into construction, as Iraq, heads into again become more of a normal, country. I think the cost to Iran is going to become more higher, and then the question is, can they sustain it? And finally, I would argue that it has what I call a stability problem. And by stability, I mean is that Iran's regional policy has been achieved due to instability, uprisings, weak, fragile states where they have been operating. As these conflicts are de-escalating, as we are seeing in Iraq, as these conflicts, as these states are regaining, a sense of normalcy, as we are seeing maybe in the future in Syria, you are going to have more of constraints on what Iran can do. And we're already seeing that in Syria. I mean, today, Iran has had major problem in translating all the sacrifices it has put in the survival of Assad regime into any kind of economic clout, from the Assad regime. And it's going to be even getting more of that kind of constraint going forward.
All right, I'll come back and I'm going to ask you a question. Please prepare yourself after
God.
Natan.
Oh my God.
And the question is, no, it's an easy question. The question is this. It's a conventional wisdom to say that Iran has become a regional power because of the mistakes others have made.
Yeah.
So the question I have from you after Natan.
Partly, I said.
Partly.
Partly.
Why only Iran took advantage of it?
Yeah,
Why
that's a
is
good
it
point.
that other countries could not take it? What is it about what Iran is doing that has allowed Iran to expand its power for the first time in at least a couple of 100 years, way beyond its border? I'll come back after this. And I want to say you're absolutely right about Syria. And I want to add something to what you said, that in the early days of the revolution, when Assad wrote a letter and sent the Holy Quran to Ayatollah Khomeini, and he said, "We are going to be with you." At that time, there was a constituency inside Ayatollah Khomeini's circle called the Syrian Mafia. These were Iranian revolutionaries who were trained by the Assad regime prior to the 1979 revolution. Now, Nathan, your job is very easy. It's about Israel and Iran. Please tell us, what are the major strategic differences or trigger points between Iran and Israel? They're far away from each other, and yet they have been in constant, at least ideological fight. What are those trigger points? And more importantly, do you see any possibility of a direct military confrontation between Iran and Israel, not in Syria, not in Lebanon, but in Tehran and Tel Aviv?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure. I'd like to answer a question, I guess, by starting with exactly the point that my two co-panelists made, which is Iran's remarkable success in expanding its influence in the region. And it's had effective starting first in Lebanon in the 80s, but of course among Palestinians, especially in the Gaza Strip with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and to a lesser degree Hamas, and in many other parts of the region as well. You couple that, if you're thinking from Israeli eyes for a moment, if you couple that with something that you answered very well in the previous panel, the chance of death to America, there's a death to another country, of course, which is death to Israel, which, as you said, sounds quite bad if you're on the other side of it, but it's to Israelis in particular, because first, it's easier to cause death to Israel than it is to America, and secondly, it's been more evident. So the struggle between Iran and Israel, let's be perfectly blunt, is not just ideological. It's been a very bloody battle for decades now. I mentioned Hezbollah, I mentioned Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Israel's a very small place. If you think of Israelis who were born, say, in the 70s, 80s, their formative years were sort of punctuated by suicide bombings by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, by Hamas, certainly. And some of them directly directed by Iran, some of them financed by Iran, armed by Iran. And Hezbollah has been the source of a lot of Israel's nightmare, both in its debacle in Lebanon in the 80s, and really Hezbollah is the one that managed to make Israel pay for its terrible strategic mistake in getting involved there, and then continued to pursue Israel after it withdrew to the Blue Line. And so from the Israeli perspective, this seems to be sort of this all-encompassing kind of battle. And in that sense, there's an odd asymmetry. Israel is sometimes considered to be the stronger power, close to the United States, etc. But Iran is, of course, much bigger. And in fact, from the Israeli perspective at least, it's sort of encircled from the southwest in Gaza, from the east and the West Bank, north and northeast in Lebanon and Syria. Israeli planners, Israeli officials of all stripes will say very candidly, not just as a talking point, that they really see Iranian involvement in almost any worry they have. Almost any, not only. And they say this truly when they're thinking about how they plan forward, they're always concerned with Iran. The joke which I've repeated too many times is that, for the Israelis, the three top priorities, strategically speaking, are Iran, Iran, and Iran. And it is quite true. Now, it is sort of obsessive, but of course, paranoia doesn't mean that you're not actually being chased. And in that sense, it's real. So where does it actually stand? What are the trigger points? Well, hovering above everything, of course, is the nuclear question, the question of the nuclear program, the JCPOA, the death of the JCPOA. The Israelis are very, very concerned about this. Maybe more than any is someone who happens to be the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, also former Defense Minister Netanyahu and previously Prime Minister Ehud Barak, both very hawkish on this. Netanyahu, more than anyone, really speaking in existential terms, arguing that if someone says death to you, you have to at least think they might mean it, and that if they're trying to acquire the means to actually affect that, then you have to prepare for that option. And so that's a very, hovering over everything, a very serious concern. At the moment, it's sort of dormant because, first, because the JCPOA actually put a cap on some of the enrichment, and second, because the Trump administration, even before it and all the JCPOA, but also after, came in with this very forceful threat that they are obsessed with Iran, they might attack, Bolton is just planning it, it's about to happen. And so from the Israeli perspective, they adopted what the Israelis were hoping that Obama would do, which was sort of this relentless pressure, not allowing Iran to even think about advancing the nuclear program, and therefore, in the Israeli minds, affecting real deterrence against the Iranian program. But you can believe that, of course, the Israelis are watching this extremely closely, both on questions of enrichment and on issues especially of R&D, which they were worried about very much before the JCPOA was annulled in particular. So that's sort of the umbrella. But then on the conventional and the regional perspective, there are several very crucial flashpoints. The most important, perhaps, or the end of a lot of it, remains where it all started, which is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is very, very different than it was in the 1980s. It's a formidable force. It's not on par with Israel. It's not on par with most states. But it is more powerful than the Lebanese state, considerably so. And it participated in the, civil war is one way to call what they did in Syria. And they have come out of that with a very serious threat to Israel. So you see Israel now, just recently in this operation that was publicized also, to uncover tunnels that were dug underneath the border from Lebanon into Israel. It's a bit like what happens in Gaza, though it's much harder to dig in the north. The terrain is very different. And the Israelis had very much prepared for the idea that the next round with Hezbollah, whenever it happens, would start not with 2006 kidnapping killing and then kidnapping of bodies of some soldiers, but rather infiltration. And as Nasrallah had said a few times, perhaps the capture of even just one small Israeli village, which would be a huge PR success for Hezbollah and a huge debacle for the Israeli government, even if just one small village was captured. I should say my sister works right on the border. I hope it doesn't happen. The second, so that's the first. So I have my biases. Related to that, very closely related to that, of course, is the Syrian theater. It's not only about a conduit to Hezbollah, it's also about Syria itself. But from the Israeli perspective, Iran put an enormous amount of effort into this war. And it managed to come out not alone on the victorious side after this horrendous massacre of Syrians. And after all that effort, and given the strategic importance of Syria and of the conduit to Lebanon, Iran is not about to give up on what it gained in that war. And that is, in particular, the ability to deploy forces or deploy the IRGC close to Israel, close to Jordan, not just Israel, and close to Lebanon in particular. And so for the Israelis, you've heard the reports, you've seen them, dozens of strikes against Iranian forces in Syria and in Lebanon, often with the attempt to prevent the transfer of advanced weaponry to Hezbollah, but not just that. When the war in Syria started, the Israelis there was a debate inside Israel, and they publicly came out with a decision that they have no horse in that race, that they're not strong enough to affect the outcome. They tried that in Lebanon and failed, and Syria is much bigger. and that therefore they're going to stay out of it with clear red lines. And the red lines were the transfer of advanced weaponry to Hezbollah or chemical weapons to them or to some Salafi group. And now they have added, in the last year and a half or so, they've added another red line, which is permanent Iranian installations in Syria. So they're not going to go after every Iranian necessarily in Syria. They're there all the time. But they have gone out in a very robust way after Iranian installations. So the possibility of a confrontation in Syria is very real. In fact, it's already happening. We've seen actual fire between Iranians and Israelis. And I'd add to that two other flashpoints that are important, which is Gaza and the West Bank. Iranian influence in both is still formidable, especially with PIJ, with Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's very much sort of a Hezbollah model, but it's of course much weaker. It's not a very popular movement. Hamas is very different. It has taken a shift towards Egypt and the Arab states and a bit away from Iran, but there are those in Hamas that still very much would like to work with Iran. And Hamas, like anyone, is opportunistic. And Iran has been able to be the most effective spoiler of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process for decades, in the 90s in particular. And so there you could imagine a flashpoint as well. I'd say one other point, you raised Azerbaijan, and it's interesting. Spoken about the Israeli perspective, that's what I know more about, of course. But the flashpoint, of course, is also on the other side. Israel has been very active, reportedly, in assassination of scientists and relations with Azerbaijan, again, reportedly, are quite close as a matter of opportunity. Yes. Here's a country right by Iran, has an enemy, Armenia, etc., an opportunity for Israel, an opportunity for Azerbaijan. So you could imagine if configuration happened, it would be there. I'll end quickly with your most important point. Could there be a major confrontation? The short answer is yes. The short answer is the way the Israelis, and to a lesser degree perhaps the Iranians, I know less about that, but the way they view this conflict is as a core fundamental conflict that shapes their whole foreign policy. I'll tell you a secret. Israel's not in love with Saudi Arabia. There actually isn't, this dream of the Wahhabi theocracy.
This is a secret?
This is a secret. But my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so for the Israelis, the overriding animosity, the overriding fear of Iran kosherizes immediately, certainly even the Saudis, certainly others, but even the Saudis. I hope the Saudis probably won't like that, but it does. And so in that sense, it's a fundamental conflict. And if the Israelis perceive that the nuclear program is being restarted in a meaningful way, I wouldn't rule out anything. I don't know what the Americans exactly would do. And if that happened, Hezbollah would probably be deployed in this. You could imagine a quite serious configuration between both.
One quick question before I go to Tabatabai, and that is, they've had over 200, at least, according to the Israelis, attack on the Iranian facilities in Syria. The argument that Iran is trying to open a new front against Israel in Syria. They already have opened a front in southern Lebanon, and now they're trying to open a second line. And Netanyahu is on record for saying he's not going to allow this to happen. No permanent military bases. At the same time, Iran has spent quite a bit of money, lost about 2,000 fighters. I'm talking about Iranian fighters, not Hezbollah and other Shiites from Pakistan and Afghanistan. Why do you think is it that Iran has not responded to these military strikes? Is that because Iran doesn't have the capability, or there is some other calculations behind it?
That's an excellent question. The short answer is I think that Iran has been very capable for a long time to take the long view, as already has been said. They're very opportunistic. You listen to Israelis even, they speak with a lot of respect towards Qasem Soleimani, no love, but a lot of respect, which is to say that in Syria in particular, the Israelis felt that the past year has been a year of success. 2018 really was a year of Israeli success in Syria. They managed to strike against them. For the most part, they managed to get Russian, at least acquiescence in most cases. That's gone worse than it started out, but at least acquiescence for Israel doing this. And the response was there, but it was almost token from the Iranians and was not very effective. And the way the Israelis view it generally is that simply in the Syrian theater, the Iranians were not capable or are not capable at the moment of responding. That the Israeli air power in particular is simply superior there and is able to counter. But they do not think the story is over. And they speak often of, in fact, one of our visiting fellows, who's an Israeli, wrote last year about exactly this. The strike back will come. And the question is where. And in the past, it sometimes has come as far as Buenos Aires. but it will come in some context and will probably be very bloody. And so the short answer is I don't think they could, but the story is far from over.
All right. Now going back to Iran's regional policy, Tip O'Neill used to say that all politics are local. Even foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. With that in mind, how can we expect the dynamics of Iran's internal politics to impact its regional policies? Where do you see the relationship between what you correctly said, a new constituency in Iran who is opposing Iranian expansionism, and Iran's regional policy?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because when the Syrian civil war started, in the first few years of the war, it was a very controversial topic in Tehran. And I'm not just talking about the population, which of course was watching what was happening in Syria with horror. It was reminiscent for a lot of people of 2009 and what had happened domestically. So it was hitting close to home. But there was also internal debate within the regime about Syria and Iran's role in the conflict, especially when you started seeing reports of the use of chemical weapons and as more and more people started to be essentially slaughtered by the Assad regime. I think that's largely changed since 2014, partially because of the rise of ISIS. But also partially because I think you now see more of a, not an embrace necessarily, but more of a shift toward the sort of regime mainstream position. That Iranian presence in these different conflicts and its support for various groups is actually a tool of foreign policy that allows Iran to maximize benefits and to minimize costs. You mentioned, at the beginning that that the cost of Iran's interventions has not been as high as we tend to think. This is something that Secretary Pompeo and others have been trying to highlight a lot on social media to Iranians, right? Tweeting in Persian saying, this is the cost of your country's interference in the domestic affairs of other countries. This is all of the money that you could be saving and you could be putting toward jobs and toward creating opportunities for your own people. I'm not sure that message is necessarily received the way the administration would like it to be received. Because if you're sitting in Iran and you're looking at what's going on in your region and you're looking at your own sort of situation vis-a-vis the United States and other adversaries, you find yourself in a place where you have no state allies, essentially, aside from Assad potentially. Not potentially, but aside from Assad. The majority of your region you have either very serious tensions with or relations are not fantastic. And you have the world's still sole superpower essentially as an adversary. And then you have Israel, of course. So what does that leave you with? That leaves you with very few means to actually deter your adversaries, to allow you to expand your influence, to secure yourself, but also to kind of build a presence in the region. And that's the use of non-state actors. Now, that has not been popular. I remember already in 2009, I remember hearing in the streets of Tehran something that has become quite, everybody now hears and reads in the newspapers, which is that, people are questioning why their country is putting resources, is putting money into Syria and into the West and Hezbollah and the West Bank when it should be spending that money at home. That led to a bunch of slogans in 2009. Those slogans are still being chanted in Iran, and I'm pretty sure that they will be chanted for a while to come without necessarily leading to significant changes in foreign policy. And again, the reason being that the calculation is different. They think of the costs of the support with the sanctions and isolation that comes with it as being lower than the benefits they're getting. Right? Again, we're talking about Iran being at the height of its essentially power in not just the past 4 decades, but perhaps in the past few centuries. It has managed to increase its strategic depth. It has, we're talking in the National Defense Strategy about Iran being on a par essentially with Russia and China, right? The 4 countries that are singled out are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. 3 of those countries have nuclear weapons. Two of them have significant economies. One of them is the second most big power. And then you have Iran. So if you're sitting in Tehran and you're thinking about how to maximize your benefits, how to continue to expand that influence, the costs are not that significant. So I'm not sure that the administration's strategy of sort of highlighting the costs of Iran's interventions abroad is going to be fruitful in the way that it wants it to. Again, not to say that the policies are popular, not to say that these are not things that have created tensions. And perhaps once Syria enters reconstruction, we will see again the emergence of tensions within the system about what Iran's role should be. But meanwhile, I think that there is a pretty mainstream, pretty steady way of looking at the region, and that has produced the policies that we're seeing, that I'm not seeing going anywhere.
We have about 35 minutes, so I'm going to ask a quick question from both of you. Please talk no more than 5 minutes so that we can go to the audience. Let me start with you. One of the most important alliances, enduring alliances in the Middle East in the post-World War II is the alliance between Iran and Syria, which goes, as you correctly said, to 40 years ago. But there is a new element. There is a triple alliance between Hezbollah, Assad, and Iran. Please tell us, what are the implications of this important alliance for President Trump's decision to get the 2,000 or so American troops out of Syria?
That's a very good question. I think so far the takeaway of this alliance, at least from what we are hearing from officials in Hezbollah, in Damascus, in Tehran, is they are trumpeting this decision of withdrawal by President Trump as being a victory for the alliance, that this is another symbol of what these policies that they have all invested in Syria in, despite the cost, human cost, more so for Hezbollah and other Arab Shia and Pakistani and Afghanistani, Syrian, than it is for Iran. So they are trumpeting this. I think the problem is that I would look at that decision as being a double-edged sword as far as the alliance is concerned. I think on one hand, the exit of the US from Syria is going to deny both Hezbollah and Iran an important narrative that can be sold at home, which is we are there to fight the Americans. We are there for especially Hezbollah constituency, we are there against the US and Israeli hegemonic project. We are there to make sure that, Israel and the US do not basically create the kind of instability again that will come to haunt us. So I think that narrative with the US exit from Syria, and again, I have to say, I'm not fully sure that the Americans are going to fully exit. I think there is this base called a 10th, which is more in the southeastern corner of the country. I think there is still a very strong debate in the Trump administration about wanting to keep there the presence there under pressure from the Israelis.
And why that region?
It's okay. I think there is a lot being done about this base being there to prevent this corridor from Iran through Iraq to Damascus. I don't think a few thousand forces are going to prevent this corridor. I think the pressure from the Israelis on the Americans, and it's a strong pressure right now to keep this base, is about the symbolism. Is that America is not exiting the region. That's the more important element why the base needs to be there. And it's a message not only, as you said earlier in the first panel, not only to Israel, but it's to its Arab allies in the region, U.S. Arab allies in the region, that U.S. is not really exiting Syria as now is being promised. So I think there will be an exit, but we might not have the full exit that everybody has been thinking of. That's one. The second problem is that I think this decision to withdraw is going to accentuate the ongoing competition in Syria among Iran, Russia, and Turkey for influence in Syria. both Iran and both Turkey and Russia have been working either jointly or individually to constrain Iran's sphere of influence in Syria. And I think the U.S. exit decision is going to accentuate this scramble, this competition. But more importantly, it's going to shine the spotlight more on what divides some of these allies, especially on what divides Turkey and Iran in Syria. Because until recently, Turkey and Iran had a common basically ground on the basis of their shared opposition to U.S. policy in northeastern Syria. I think with the U.S. exit now, what we are going to see is there will be the spotlight on more the divergences between Turkey and Iran in terms of their position vis-a-vis Assad and vis-a-vis the Syrian regime. So that's going to be a quoting Jeff Bezos, complexifying factor going forward for Iran, but also for Russia. And the third impact of the U.S. decision to withdraw is going to be it's who's going to fight ISIS. I mean, I know Trump administration is going to say, oh, well, we are defeating ISIS, ISIS defeated. No, ISIS is not going to be 100% defeated, especially in an area like Deir ez-Zor. There will be cells, there will be sleeper cells of ISIS. So who's going to devote the resources to keep these extremists from recruiting again? That's going to be an additional stressor on Iran, on Syrian regime, on Russia, because until now the fight against ISIS has been pretty much shouldered by the Americans and by the Kurdish SDF.
Last question about Israel and Iran. You shared a secret with us. Let me share a secret about Iran with you. And that is, although there is consensus inside the governing elite that Iran should oppose Israeli policy toward Palestine, there is no consensus about what Iran has been doing to Israel. Because there is a number of very powerful people, I don't want to mention any name, that I know, believe that we need to normalize Iran relations with the US, and the road to that normalization go through Tel Aviv. They're not going to talk about it publicly because that is questioning the foundation of the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic, but there is that consensus. There is that faction in Iran. Having said that now, is there a consensus inside Israel about the threat Iran poses? Does Mr. Netanyahu really represent the thinking, the strategic thinking of the Israeli top generals and intelligence officers?
So I think if you think of the Israeli position on Iran, I differentiate first an important point which relates to what you said, which is that fundamentally many Israelis in the public and in the elite don't think that there's some inherent Iranian-Israeli historic issue. You pointed out they're very far from one another. Many Israelis remember the relations under the Shah, and they don't have much of an opinion on Shah versus others, but they do. So there is this appreciation for Iran and this sort of feeling that there shouldn't be a conflict between Iranians and Israelis, where they have a very strong animosity as the Islamic Republic. And on that, the consensus is quite strong. So if you think of the Israeli political scene on the Palestinian issue, for example, there's pretty wide variance of opinions. There are people on the left, prominent leaders, some of them in town, who will speak very openly against the occupation, who will say that Israel should withdraw from the West Bank, that there should be a Palestinian state. These are commonplace things. Even Netanyahu said Palestinian state, but in much more tangible ways. You have a wide divergence. You have people on the right who say never a Palestinian state, we should build more settlements. On the Iranian issue, there is a difference of opinion, but it's much narrower. Netanyahu, I would say, is certainly a hawk or the hawk, especially in the way he speaks of the existential threat. Before he became prime minister, he said the year is 1938, referring, of course, to the war, or 1932 maybe, before the rise of the Nazis. I don't remember which it was, but in other words, the deep existential. And there are no more powerful words, of course, for Israelis and Jews. And so, saying, in other words, that existential threat is there. Everyone go to arms. In the Israeli elite, you don't have that. So many other people, even Ehud Barak, who was his twin in hawkishness, never spoke that way. He always said we shouldn't say existential. Of course, it's existential in the sense that a nuclear weapon could wipe out Israel, but we can face it. We can deter it, even if they get the bomb. That said, the left side of this debate is still very hawkish on Iran. There's no one, or I'm going to say no one, but there's very, very few people, certainly in the elite, but also in the public, who don't think that Iran is extremely active all over the region in attacking Israel, is behind a lot of the bloody attacks against Israel, is pursuing a nuclear program. In that sense, the Mossad archive that the Mossad brought about surprised exactly no one in Israel. Everyone has assumed that. I'll say one last point, is that on the JCPOA, I think a lot of people have spoken of a difference, especially between the generals and the elite. And there is sometimes some difference, but I think it's a bit overblown. On the Palestinian issue, many of the generals are often much more dovish than the elite. On Gaza, for example, not very dovish, but more dovish than the political, at least this government. On the Iranian issue, there is some difference in the sense that some of the people in the security establishment, military and intelligence, were speaking of some advantages to the JCPOA. It's a done deal, therefore we should work with it, these kinds of things. But this idea that somehow the generals or the intelligence people were in love with the JCPOA and are dovish on Iran and think that Iran's about to change, and really it's just a bit misunderstood, is simply not true. The Israeli elite is quite narrowly in agreement of the threat and of the need to confront it.
I want to go to the audience, but the quick question follow-up. Does the Iranian nationals, Iranian Jews who have gone to Israel and occupied important positions in the government, do they have any kind of impact on Israeli policy at this time?
Like the Russian Jews with the rapprochement between Israel and Russia, they played a big role in that.
Yeah, they do. So Russian-speaking Israelis have a big role, but partly because relations with Russia are open. And so many of them can have, Avigdor Lieberman was the former defense minister, would meet with Putin, or at least his counterparts, and could simply speak with them in Russian. And when Netanyahu meets with Putin, his interpreter is actually a senior minister, Zev Elkin, a very important player in his cabinet, very smart man. And so that's meaningful. Iranian Israelis, it's very different. So there was a former president, Moshe Katsav, a former minister of defense, Shaul Mofaz. They were extremely influential. Shaul Mofaz was minister of defense, actually much more important than the president, but and in that sense, very, very influential. But to tell you that had a strong direct effect on his attitude towards Iran, no, I don't think so.
All right, thank you very much. Now we're going to go to the
Sorry, I lost this, but it's okay.
To the audience, please, what I'm going to ask you to have a short question with a question mark at the end. And if you want to make a comment, please make it short. I'm going to ask two people to talk, and then any of you who want to respond should respond. What is it? Yes, since you are one of the important people here, I have no choice but to give you.
You have no
audience.
choice, Mohsen. Thank you.
And the way you looked at me,
He had really no choice.
I had
really
absolutely no choice.
Thank you guys so much. Really fascinating. I wanted to give Ariane a chance to talk about Iran, Russia, China. I know you've written a book on the topic. Are we witnessing a real solid transformation of Iranian foreign policy in that direction? You know, you used to say not east, not west. Are they really looking east, or is this perhaps not on totally solid ground? Thanks.
One other question. The gentleman right there, please. Would somebody give the microphone to this gentleman right there?
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Yeah, I'd like to follow up actually on Barbara's question and throw in where Qatar might fit into this. I noticed the Emir was over with Xi Jinping a couple of days ago. There's oil deals being made. There's talk of the petro-yuan. So you do have a configuration there. And when you emphasize the change, this is not 10 years ago, again, with the China, you have the whole Belt and Road Initiative. This is absolutely crucial. So
we'll
I just throw that into Barbara's question.
Thank you. We'll go to China and Russia with you, and Qatar with you, please.
Oh. Thank you, Barbara, for the plug. I think it was Nazila this morning who mentioned Khatami making comments about not chanting death to America when he was president. And I think that is actually a pretty powerful reminder of what his presidency was about, which was all about looking west, right? He was trying to normalize relations with the West. And then along comes Ahmadinejad, and we all know the rest. He was very much east-looking. He was actually looking to both Russia and China, but also Africa and Latin America. And very much, and then after that, Rouhani again, who tried to balance a bit more, but ultimately whose main objective was to normalize relations with the Europeans in particular, not the West in general, the United States certainly, but especially the Europeans. And I think the Islamic Republic over the past 40 years has had this sort of back and forth. The slogan, neither East nor West, in reality has been both East and West in some ways, but neither of them in practice. The relationship with Russia and China, Iran's relations with Russia and China are pretty fascinating to me. I think they really highlight a component of the three countries that we tend to understate, which is how pragmatic they are. And I don't mean this in a positive, they're positive actors. I mean it in a, they're interest-driven players who manage to, despite their divergent ideologies, work together pretty well. And I think that's led to a relationship that is based on shared interests, where all three recognize that they have overlapping interests. You can see that in Russia with and Syria with Russia. You can say it in the Persian Gulf with China with the One Belt, One Road. But they also have inherently different interests in other areas, and they've managed to compartmentalize all of that. So the Russians and the Iranians have a long history of distrust, wars, treaties. Some of the most humiliating defeats for Iran have come at Russian hands. You have tensions in the Caspian, and yet the two countries have been able to work together in a number of areas over the past few decades. The nuclear program being the sort of poster child for Russian-Iranian cooperation, where the Russians were the main supplier for Iran's nuclear program after the revolution. With the Chinese, it's sort of similar, where you have a lot of distrust. It's not as historically grounded as it is with Russia. The two countries haven't had a war in several centuries. But there is a distrust that actually really stems from the modern relationship between the two countries, where if you go to the market in Iran and try to buy something, the first thing the seller will tell you is that it's not Chinese, even though 90% of the time it is, because there is this distrust of Chinese services, Chinese products in Iran. So one of the key drivers, and again this morning on the panel, folks mentioned that the Iranians came back to the negotiating table not just because of sanctions, but because of domestic politics. I think a key factor there was the fact that they wanted to break away from Russian and Chinese monopoly over key sectors of the Iranian economy. But ultimately, I think that what we're seeing is a bit of a balancing act again by Iran, where the Iranians initially after the JCPOA were very excited for European business to come in. There were a number of channels between Europe and Iran. They were even eager to talk about human rights, including hardliners within the government, which you wouldn't expect them to want to talk about human rights with the Europeans. But increasingly, as sanctions have kicked in, as the Europeans have proven unable to be this bulwark against U.S. sanctions and U.S. policy, again, you've had this sort of shift gradually toward returning to resuming activities with Russia and China. Now, we're also seeing a bit of again, going back to the interest, both the Russians and the Chinese have been slow in signing contracts with Iran, have been slow, and I think you'll talk about this in the afternoon with people who are much more economically savvy than I am, but they've been quite slow. This is, again, a trend we've seen in the past where they showed kind of a pragmatic wait-and-see approach before ultimately really strengthening their positions in Iran.
In a true spirit of Persian despotism, I'm going to ask you to make it short, or else I'm going to cut you off, because I want the people to be able to ask questions. So go ahead.
Quickly,
Just
I think. Quickly, yeah.
When
quickly,
it came to you, I started.
I know.
imposing
Have you noticed that?
Persian.
Have
Yes,
you noticed?
yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's a Persian-Arab thing.
Absolutely.
Total depiction of that rivalry between us.
Go ahead,
Joking.
please. Yes, I know.
So I think in terms of Qatar, very much similar to what you said in terms of convergence in certain areas, economics, divergence in other areas. When it comes to Syria, for example, major divergence there. But I think what's happening is that initially, one of the drivers of the Iranian-Qatar relationship is also Qatar being the country within the GCC, well before the spat within the GCC between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to basically push for some kind of a rapprochement between Iran and the GCC, particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I think with this spat now between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which big part of it has to do with the Iranian-Qatar relationship. I think the usefulness of Qatar to Iran in terms of being a means of advancing a rapprochement strategy within the GCC with Iran has diminished.
And don't forget the importance of shared gas.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Shared
yes.
economic interests.
Absolutely,
Yes, that's
absolutely.
fine.
The gentleman right here, please. And next I'm going to go to a lady to be balanced. Let's go ahead, please.
Thank you. Alan Kieswetter with the Middle East Institute. And I have a short question, which is, which part of this, if any part of this role in the region is negotiable? Or to rephrase it, what would have to happen so it would be negotiable?
Any of you want to
What
answer?
would have to happen? What?
If I understand correctly,
Yes. What is there any part of the regional role of Iran in the region that is negotiable? And if not, what would have to happen so it would become negotiable?
negotiable.
I can
Excellent
take a
question.
step quickly. Yeah, I think the places where you see the most shared interests are Afghanistan and Iraq, and there is a history of cooperation in both those areas. And I think that even today, the Iranians fully understand that if the United States withdraws completely from both those countries, that the Iranians will be picking up the pieces, and it'll be a big mess that they can't deal with. They don't have the capabilities, the willingness to deal with it. So I think those two areas are the sort of low-hanging fruits in that sense. And I would add Yemen. Mainly because Yemen is the opposite of Afghanistan and Iraq in that it is not close by, they don't share borders, so what happens there doesn't affect Iran. Iran has been using it as as sort of a cheap opportunity to poke the Saudis in the eye, which the Saudis have helped greatly. So I think Yemen would actually be a good place to start as well, where the Iranians would be willing to compromise more than they would be in, say, a place like Syria, where they've paid a price both in blood and treasure.
Very good.
I agree
Go ahead.
quickly. I agree on the first on Iraq and Afghanistan as being a negotiable areas. I disagree on Yemen. I think when it comes, and we have disagreed, you and I, in the past on Twitter and whatever. I think when it comes to Yemen, it's going to be extremely hard for the Saudis to accept any Iranian role there in their backyard going forward, and I think it's going to be difficult. But Iraq and Afghanistan, especially Afghanistan more than Iraq, is definitely a negotiable area.
A young lady right there, please. Would you give the phone? Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dee Parvaz with Think Progress. I cover this administration's foreign policy, so I have to ask this. Please forgive me. And anybody can answer this if they want. What do you make of any kind of upcoming peace plan that this administration is about to unveil? Well, we understand that Jared Kushner will be headed to the region. So far, only a select number of Gulf Arab countries to unveil the economic portion of it. We're not sure exactly what that is, but how much faith do you have in the economic or non-economic portion of this, addressing any of what you've discussed today? Thank you.
Nathan, you want to?
Yeah.
I'd love to.
I know you were.
Do you know that piece?
Yes.
By the way.
I've heard that there's a plan. So I'll tell you my private evolution, although it doesn't interest anyone. I do firmly believe now there is a plan. I believe it's long. I believe they do intend to publish it. People sometimes ask me if Israelis or Palestinians think that it will bring peace. In the past, I would answer, in the Kerry plan, for example, that no, Israelis and Palestinians generally were very pessimistic. These days, no one even asks the question among Israelis and Palestinians. It's not entertained as a possibility that this will bring peace. The differences between the parties are profound. The Trump administration has managed to distance itself from the Palestinians profoundly and really broken relations, so much so that the Israelis have much more contact and relations with the Palestinian Authority than do the Americans, which is remarkable. All that said, this also has a role that I think relates more to our panel, which is it is in the context of a Trump administration that is premising everything on relations with the Saudis, with the Israelis, with the Emiratis. And so part of this peace plan also started with an initiative that was talked about as an outside-in one that would use the Arab states, especially Saudis, Emiratis, Egyptians, Jordanians, to pressure the Palestinians, also to be closer to the Israelis and try to produce peace. I don't think peace will come out of this, and I don't think it's an understatement. I'll be happy to be wrong, so it's a no-lose situation. But there is some benefit that can come out of it, which is you might see more regional cooperation. You're already seeing some, and that can be beneficial, not only in opposition to Iran, but also in other realms as well. And hopefully, I personally hope, it also would not necessarily cut off the Palestinians. It might allow the Palestinians some important benefits, even if peace and independence are not around the corner.
I know you have to disagree with him.
No, what I'm going to say, not disagree, no. What I'm going to say is that I agree with you now. I know there is a peace plan, but I don't know what is in the peace plan. But as a given, I think if that peace plan is going to require concessions from even Saudi, accepting concessions on the Palestinian side that the Palestinians cannot accept, that Abbas cannot deliver, I think it's going to be very hard for the Saudis or the Emiratis to be able to do that. I mean, it has been a given for a long time now in the Arab region. No Arab leader can force the Palestinians to accept what they are not willing to accept.
We have time for one other question, and would you give the microphone to this gentleman right there, please?
Hello, Tom Hoof, University of Massachusetts. I'm curious to know from my knowledge, at least, of where the JCPOA started as a beginning point to get out of the way the strategic issues of nuclear, to then go on to do other things that are much more difficult to negotiate. What's happened since that started? I was here a year ago with one of Barbara's, what does this look like a year later, hearing ambassadors from the signatory Western countries feeling optimistic that we could then go on and do these other things that were to happen, dealing with missiles, dealing with other issues. And now I think both the Trump administration and the Israelis are sort of purposely muddling everything and mixing it back up in a way that the JCPOA specifically said not to do. So why have we turned everything on its head, is my question.
Anybody who wants to answer, go ahead.
I don't know if I have a definitive answer. I'm not sure. There are many things there. I think I'd say I'd make 2 points. My colleague Suzanne Milani has written very extensively on this. There is the JCPOA was sold in 2 very different ways. The way the President President Obama generally spoke about it was that this is a deal on the nuclear issue. This is trying to put a cap on a strategic danger, both of an Iranian nuclear power and of proliferation in the region. What many of the people in the region, especially the allies, the Saudis, the Israelis, heard was all the other chatter that went exactly against this message, tried to say, actually, it's rapprochement. Actually, this is an attempt to go with the Iranians against the Arabs. And they believed that. They may have been right, they may have been wrong, but they believed it. And I think it echoes things that you say you heard from ambassadors. And so when you hear, I don't think it's only the Israelis and the Americans, I think it's very much the other American allies as well, Saudi Arabia chief among them. When they pushed for the annulment of the JCPOA, when they pushed for this very tough stance on Iran, it's exactly for fear that America is seeing Iran as a better prospect than the Arab world, and a better prospect maybe than the Israelis, although less likely that. And it's exactly that duality of the way the previous administration sold it that caused a lot of this confusion. Because there was a significant difference. The president, and not just him, constantly said, no, we're not selling you out to Iran, this is just about nuclear. In fact, it's because we are so concerned about the Iranian intentions and the Iranian nuclear program that we want to put a cap on it. But then there were whispers, actually, by the way, Iranian could be a major player and open up to the world and change. So why are we here? I mean, obviously the Trump administration took a very extreme position and even annulled an agreement so shortly after it was signed, and I think we're in a very different position. I will say, and I'm certainly not a fan of this administration, but I think fans of the administration would point out that the JCPOA has not crumbled. And a negotiation, a deal where the biggest party to the deal has withdrawn, still stands, might suggest that that biggest party to the deal under-negotiated its hand, because apparently Iran is willing to stick with it with much less carrots. And so I think critics of the deal in the region in particular point to this concept, like, you see, all you needed to do was threaten. Deterrence works. You didn't need to give them all those things, legitimize enrichment, agree to all these things, forget about the previous program, never mention clearing the past, nothing. You see, all you needed to do was make clear that you will not accept a nuclear program actively pursuing a weapon, and they won't do it like they're not doing it now.
May I add something?
Yes, please.
So let's bring in the European perspective here, right? The Europeans largely pursued the JCPOA thinking that they would get a nuclear deal which would put a cap on the nuclear program, and that would allow them to then negotiate on other aspects of Iranian behavior, which is, I think, funny enough, part of the driver behind Rouhani's policy as well. Right after the JCPOA, he came out and said, look, we have a nuclear deal now, but if we want the rest of sanctions to be lifted, then let's talk about the missile program, and let's talk about regional issues. It was an understanding, I think, on both sides that the JCPOA wasn't going to put a cap on all of Iran's activities, but that it was going to be the stepping stone toward more negotiations, which would allow the West to address some of its biggest grievances with Iran. The problem, of course, with President Trump's withdrawal of the JCPOA a few months ago is that it removes that sort of stepping stone. I think the Europeans are still trying very hard to preserve the JCPOA so that they can get to that point, but the US withdrawal makes it a lot more difficult. So the JCPOA hasn't collapsed yet, but I think yet is a big element of it. Right after President Trump announced that he was withdrawing the US from the JCPOA, Khamenei made this big speech where he talked about what was next. And the big things to take away, I think, are still true in that speech, which was that Iran would continue to implement the deal for now and wait and see what the Europeans were going to deliver. Meanwhile, it was going to begin taking the steps toward expanding its nuclear program if the JCPOA collapsed. So if you're sitting in Tehran now and you're looking at what's happening in the United States, well, you're faced with two scenarios. One is 2020 comes and President Trump is out of the office, and then you have either a Democrat or a different Republican who is either willing to go back into the JCPOA or at least who's willing to renegotiate, in which case you, Iran, have gained a number of you can gain a number of concessions because you're now the sort of responsible party who stayed in the deal and who's coming back to the table being responsible. The alternative is President Trump stays in power, and then you're looking at a 2025, I guess, change in administration, in which case you have to reevaluate your calculation. And I think that if we are faced with a 2025 power transition in the United States, the JCPOA may not survive that long.
With this, please join me to give a nice round of applause to our panelists.